Most cities actually make it illegal to build things like duplexes and triplexes.
It's going to increase the cost of housing once again.
Mr. Chair, there are 16 ayes, 17 nays.
Washington faces a major housing shortage, and lawmakers in Olympia have been debating some zoning rule changes to allow more multifamily projects statewide, especially near transit.
We're in a place where this is a crisis.
But critics say a one-size-fits-all approach to housing doesn't work.
I think we need to go back to the drawing board.
Should individual cities or the state get to decide on local zoning rules?
This policy reduces government interference.
2 local mayors weigh in.
There is no guarantee that it would be considered affordable housing.
The debate over Washington's missing middle housing, next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. A controversial proposal in Olympia requiring cities to change their zoning laws to encourage the building of more duplexes or quadplexes may be dead this session, but it's opened the door to a fierce debate. Supporters of the idea to allow for more density near transit stops say this will help relieve a statewide housing shortage and correct discriminatory zoning rules. But critics say this push for so-called missing middle housing is missing the mark, with a one-size-fits-all approach that could make our state's affordable housing crisis even worse.
We have to be very strategic with how we use the current amount of land for housing that is available.
Hugo Garcia, a Burien City Council member speaking on his own behalf, deals with housing and homelessness often in his work. But it was his own personal experience, looking for a house in Burien 15 years ago, that truly changed his perspective.
I just didn't want to live far from where I grew up. I wanted to be close to home.
He ended up buying a duplex in Burien with his brother, a home they could afford together. And Garcia says allowing for more of these types of homes in cities across the state could add much-needed supply to a housing market where demand and prices are skyrocketing.
This housing provides for a lot of people in a small amount of space, but in a way that is livable. It's a home.
State Representative Jessica Bateman agrees.
We really need to think differently about what type of housing that we allow in Washington state.
Bateman, the Democrat from the 22nd District in Olympia, is the prime sponsor of House Bill 1782. It died this week before the legislative cutoff, but she says the fight will continue. 1782 would require cities with populations of 20,000 or more to allow for multi-unit housing, up to quadplexes, on all lots zoned as single-family residential that are within a half-mile of a major transit stop. Cities with populations of 10,000 or more would be required to allow for at least duplexes on all lots zoned as single-family residential.
We really need to act collectively and lift bans on these modest home choices because unfortunately, most cities actually make it illegal to build things like duplexes and triplexes.
Oregon and California have recently passed similar legislation to encourage building so-called missing middle housing. And Bateman says if Olympia doesn't act on this issue now, state residents will suffer for generations to come.
We have to do something to help ensure that the young people in Washington today can live in the same communities that they grew up in. And that currently is not something that is a realistic option for them.
But the Association of Washington Cities, a lobbying group which represents all 281 Washington cities and towns before the legislature, says 1782 could cause the very problems it's trying to solve.
We're very concerned that the current proposal will exacerbate displacement risk.
Carl Schroeder from the AWC says if cities allow for more multi-unit homes to be built, that would incentivize builders to tear down older, more affordable homes and replace them with more expensive ones, pushing housing prices up even further.
And so if you're taking something that's 35 years old and then building a brand new building, the cost is going to be higher. That's just a market reality.
Schroeder says the cities he works with support the goals of HB 1782, but he says if the state isn't finding new ways to build affordable housing, the bill won't work.
We can plan about it all we want, but if we don't have the resources to invest in housing that is affordable to people, it's hard to see how we would be successful.
A number of state lawmakers have echoed that sentiment.
We have increased the cost of construction. We've increased rules and regulations.
Representative Michelle Caldier, the Republican from the 26th District in Port Orchard, says 1782 could also create an unfunded mandate of major regulatory costs for smaller cities.
They're going to pass it on to the housing, to the builders. It's going to be passed on to the people. It's going to increase the cost of housing once again.
But lifelong Burien resident Hugo Garcia says cities need to accept it's time to replace exclusionary zoning and make room for more modest developments.
We're not efficient enough. We haven't been. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the situation where we're at.
The challenge now? Deciding if a ban on single-family zoning designations statewide is the right answer.
Every single person in Washington has a common denominator. We all need stable housing.
In terms of this particular proposal, I think we need to go back to the drawing board.
And joining us to discuss this issue, we have with us Nancy Backus. She is the mayor of Auburn. Mayor Backus, good to have you here. We also have with us Mason Thompson. He is mayor of the city of Bothell. Good to have you too, Mayor Thompson. And Mayor Thompson, let me start with you on this to begin. So House Bill 1782 has died this legislative session, but its supporters say they're going to keep fighting to pass it. I want to get some overall thoughts about the concept here, though. What do you think of this idea requiring cities to allow for more duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes in areas that have been traditionally zoned for single-family residential homes?
Well, I support it because people in Bothell are frankly suffering because we haven't built enough housing and we restrict them from building more. A recent KUOW article highlighted a pro-con on missing middle. As part of it, they interviewed one resident in each of two different cities, both of whom happened to have powerful displacement stories from not being allowed to build housing. One of them, Tim, wanted to build a home in his backyard for his elderly aunt. She had mostly raised Tim. Now she had health issues, and Tim wanted to build her a home in his backyard so he could take care of the woman who raised him. He couldn't. So his aunt moved to Eastern Washington, displaced away from Tim, her friends, and her doctor, isolated and alone. Imagine her driving over the pass in the winter to see the doctor. It's probably hard for her, but I imagine it's totally worth it when she gets to stop by and see Tim, the boy she raised. Imagine how precious those moments she gets with him are. And now imagine how many more of those moments were taken from them by arbitrary rules that restrict housing, like you can only build one house on this lot. Tim said, "It's hard for me to describe the amount of frustration, trying to do what feels like the right thing my whole life, to get to the point where I can help my family, and then I'm getting held up by red tape." I support missing middle housing because of Tim and his aunt and the thousands of similar stories that are going to keep happening over and over until our leaders are willing to change what we do so we can get different results.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Mayor Backus, I'll go to you, same question here. Some opening ideas about House Bill 1782 and what it would require cities to do in terms of zoning for more duplexes, et cetera, these missing middle home options, as they're called.
So I don't think any of us disagree on the fact that we need more housing, more missing middle housing, more affordable housing for every income level. What we disagree with is the methodology and how that's going to be accomplished. Mandating something that is quite frankly an unfunded mandate for cities is not the way to have this occur. We in South King County have been the recipients, and thankfully so, of affordable housing for decades. Whenever there was, at the time called low-income housing, it was pushed to South King County. And so we have a great deal of housing stock that's affordable, but quite frankly, getting old. And our focus is on housing preservation. We are not interested in having someone come in, buy up homes that are considered affordable or entry-level housing, and then knock them down and build something that there is no guarantee that is going to be affordable for anyone. We fully agree on the need for affordable housing at all income levels.
Okay, great. And I'm going to pull apart some of those issues in just a minute here, Mayor Backus, but let me try to put a finer point on it with you, Mayor Thompson here. I want to talk about what you think might happen in Bothell if a measure like House Bill 1782 did get passed in the future. Is there enough affordable housing in your city right now? How would a bill like this affect the situation, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, as of last night, there were 15 homes for sale in Bothell. The cheapest was $850,000. So if you've got $170,000 in cash for a down payment, your payment's going to be about $4,000 a month. to buy the cheapest home currently available in Bothell. And it'll probably sell for more than that. So no, there's not enough. There's hardly any. And why aren't we talking about the impact that not building enough housing has had? Because that's had a catastrophic impact to our communities, but we treat a solution like it would be some sort of burden. If you're watching this and you're worried about how this would change your community, I get it. The way this discussion is normally framed is meant to scare you, but there's probably a Tim in your neighborhood. And if your Tim were to build an extra housing unit for his aunt a few doors down, how would you be impacted? Not as much as she was by being displaced away.
Okay, thank you for that. And Mayor Backus, I'll go back to you just to kind of visualize it for us if you could. What do you think would happen in Auburn here? I want to talk about, is there enough affordable housing in Auburn for one, and then how you think House Bill 1782 or a version of it, if it gets passed in the future, how would that affect that?
So there's never enough housing. We realize that in this region, we are woefully low on housing at all levels of income. And we work on that every day in Auburn. In fact, we took advantage of grants that were provided by the state just a few years ago to create a housing inventory and a housing action plan that addresses that very thing. We identified what our inventory was, looked to see what was needed, and now we have that action plan. $200,000, in fact, from the state to do that. And we are not the only city that did that. So allow us the time to put those action plans into effect. Don't now throw away all of the work that has been done for a bill that mandates something that, as I mentioned earlier, is an unfunded mandate in many cases.
Okay, and I want to make sure I ask, though, what do you think this missing middle concept would actually do to that plan you're talking about there? How would it mess it up? What are we talking about there?
Well, we're talking about not mandating it in every single family neighborhood, right? Okay. There are some neighborhoods in the city of Auburn that are absolutely perfect for this bill. There are some neighborhoods in our city that are absolutely not, and it would cause displacement. There's an area close to our community and event center that we have seen over time go from home ownership to rental properties and now back to home ownership. Those are some of the entry-level homes in our community that I could see being purchased by a developer, knocked down for 5 or 6 units to go on each one of those properties.
Yeah.
And there is no guarantee that it would be considered affordable housing. So how is that displacement of individuals who are working hard to own a home going to be beneficial to that neighborhood?
Got it. Mayor Thompson, let's try to engage this a little bit, what Nancy's talking about here. And I've heard this from a few critics of House Bill 1782. It doesn't have an affordability requirement built into it. And so you might have this situation that Nancy's talking about here. You have these older, more affordable homes, naturally affordable, as I've heard them called. They get torn down, and when builders come in, the incentive is to build something bigger, more expensive, or whatever else. And really, the people you're trying to help, the people that might get displaced there, aren't getting the help they need. How do you respond to that criticism?
You know, displacement from construction is a very real concern, and it's definitely something we need to deal with on a policy level. But there are massive amounts of displacement happening right now from the status quo because we don't build enough housing. That reporter from KUOW, he went to 2 cities and he knocked on 2 doors and talked to 2 neighbors, and there were 2 powerful displacement stories. So if we care about displacement from building new housing, which we should, that matters. Why do we care less about the displacement that is actually happening right now? And why do we care more about potential future displacement that may happen? It makes me think that displacement is less the concern and building more housing is really the concern. I also want to say framing this as a government mandate is a little silly. This policy reduces government interference and red tape and gives people like Tim more freedom to take care of their family with their property. In cities, we can still control everything else about construction. So neighbors can know that the missing middle that gets built will be similar in size and scale to the housing that already exists. And if we all agree that housing is a problem and not having enough of it is a problem, why are we keeping 75% of our residential neighborhoods frozen in amber and not allowed to build more housing? It doesn't make sense.
Okay. And Mayor Backus, maybe I'll have you go and respond to some of these things that Mason's talking about here, because I think we've heard this from a few different people. We're way behind in terms of cranking out the housing they need after all that we need in our state, after all the growth that's been happening here over the past several years. This missing middle idea isn't perfect, but it's a start. Please respond to that and some of what Mayor Thompson's saying too.
So the missing middle is absolutely necessary. It's the vehicle in which we get to that point is what we have the concern with. And I'm also going to share that South King County and North King County and the East Side are vastly different, right? We have been building affordable housing for decades. And it's not a one size fits all approach. It can't be. Right now in Auburn, I believe we have 30 homes for sale that are less than $400,000. We have some houses that are $225,000 entry level homes. That's not what Mayor Thompson was mentioning in Bothell. So the approach should not be the same between Auburn and Bothell. There is nothing, quite frankly, that would be stopping the city of Bothell from doing exactly what House Bill 1782 mandates. You can do that now. That local control is there. Auburn has taken their local control, and we have been building housing of all affordability levels. And as I keep mentioning that unfunded mandate, consider what would happen in a neighborhood that has been traditionally single family, entry level homes, and they're older homes. So the infrastructure that's in place, the water mains, the sewer, all of those things. If you have multiplexes coming into that neighborhood, while the developer is required to pay for the frontage in front of what they're building, they're not required to finish out the system that connects to the main portions. And so that would be on the backs of the city to accomplish that. And let me just share with you, in downtown Auburn, we were one of the first cities to have a sound transit station.
Right. Okay.
And so we looked forward to what would that mean for housing density in our downtown core. It's been over 15 years ago that we utilized local revitalization funding. We invested $10 million in infrastructure. You don't see any of it above ground. It was all to assist in having that catalyst project start in downtown Auburn for multifamily housing that's transit-oriented development. Now we have almost 800 units downtown, but it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without the expense to cities. And so housing action plans, I fully support one of the amendments that was made to 1782 about exempting cities who have a housing action plan in place from this mandate. I fully can support that and would love to work with Representative Bateman on language for next year.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Let's pull apart this issue of infrastructure here. And Mayor Thompson, do you share these concerns that a possible negative impact could be happening to your city's infrastructure if our state got rid of single-family zoning?
No, quite frankly, because no matter where Tim's aunt lives, she's going to need somebody to plan for infrastructure. The real question is, are we willing to do it, or are we going to force her to go somewhere else? I think she's important. And also, I want to point out that we have standards for missing middle housing that we don't hold the status quo to. The status quo, what exists now, when a builder buys 30 acres on the periphery to clear cut and put up 100 mansions, they have to lay miles of road, water, sewer that now has to get maintained and eventually replaced, all at taxpayer expense. And local leaders don't have any problem with that. And the thing is, when that happens, they don't build a sewer pipe straight from the new development to the treatment center. They connect to the existing infrastructure. Just like missing middle would, just like Tim's aunt would. And why do we care so much about future infrastructure for missing middle housing when, quite frankly, it's a much lower infrastructure commitment than what we allow right now and we don't complain about? Why the difference? I don't understand. And one other thing, let's be really clear. Local control and cities choosing what neighborhoods we feel this is appropriate in, this is the status quo. This is failing. This is a house getting bid up by over $1 million more than asking in Bellevue recently.
Right.
This is also isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. A one-size-fits-all approach is what's happening now. This doesn't disallow single-family homes. This just disallows more flexibility and makes building enough housing a little bit more legal.
Okay. Okay. And let me dive into this issue a little bit further if I could. And Mayor Backus, I'll go to you. I know another reason people support this bill is based on this claim that single family zoning is discriminatory and stems from a history of laws that excluded people of lower incomes from living in certain neighborhoods, often people of color. Do you see this bill as a way to answer that concern, to allow people of different income levels to enter the neighborhoods? I know that's a real hot button issue, single family zoning.
Yeah.
It certainly is here in Seattle.
Yes, and my answer to that is yes and no. Think about in that bill, there is an exclusion for HOAs, existing HOAs. HOAs are not typically low-income housing.
Yeah.
They are on the more expensive side. And so when you're excluding the HOAs, then are you creating a new form of redlining in your community? There are neighborhoods, again, that are perfect for this redevelopment or this infill, but not every neighborhood has that. And to respond to Mayor Thompson's point, utility extensions in new development is much simpler. Digging up an old infrastructure is a problem, and it does not pencil for a sixplex in a neighborhood.
Okay. Okay. I want to make sure I touch on this issue of discrimination with you, Mayor Thompson. Do you see this as an issue that touches on that?
I mean, that's the reason single family zoning became in the first place. And it still does the same thing regardless of what the intent is right now. Yeah. So yes, absolutely, that is relevant. Go read The Color of Law and look at the history of systemic discrimination around housing in the United States, and you can't help but see it continue and perpetuate everywhere. Okay. You know, regarding homeowners exclusions, I agree that shouldn't exist. But let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Again, let's hold future change to the same standard that we hold the status quo to. A little bit of something good is better than none of something good because we didn't get all of it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. I want to make sure I jumped on one more issue, if I could, here with you, Mayor Backus. You've mentioned a few different times how the city of Auburn has received grants from the state over the past couple of years to create these housing inventory plans. I want to try to look at this issue from a larger scale, if I could. Is that the kind of help you're looking for from the state, as opposed to putting a ban on single family zoning? Let's talk about this.
So incentivizing the addition of missing middle housing units is a much better way to go. The carrot and the stick approach, the carrot is always going to be better. And again, cities are going to have to challenge the status quo. I don't disagree with that. But removing the local control and assuming that it's a one-size-fits-all approach throughout the entire state is absolutely not the way to do this. There has to be some ability to respond to the need in our community. And again, Auburn and Bothell are two very different cities. One of the things we do have in common is we both sit in two counties. We both share that. Auburn is in King and Pierce, and Bothell is in King and Snohomish.
Good point.
But there are a lot of differences in how our cities were developed. And being able to acknowledge our history and build on that and build better is something that we strive for all the time.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And Mayor Thompson, I want to make sure I draw you in here. If there's anything on your wish list when it comes to things the state can do to try to help out with the affordable housing situation, maybe beyond this idea of putting a ban on single family zoning. Some thought there.
Yeah, well, the question in front of us with the bills that recently failed is, or didn't move on, is not, do we want a carrot or a stick? The question is, do we want to allow more housing or not? And if there are incentives, if there are grants to make this easier to do, I'm all for that also, but that's not a good reason to argue against more housing, which is what this bill fundamentally asked. So let's make sure that we're not arguing for something that isn't real. Like, let's argue in reality, and the reality is, do we want to accept more housing or not? And if somebody wants to run a different bill that does something different that incentivizes housing, I will be all for that too. But that's not on the table.
Yeah. Yeah, there are some different things that we will be following at the state level, but you're right. We need to see what happens with this in the future. And Mayor Thompson, we need to start wrapping up here. I can give you about a minute here. We're clearly all talking about the same goal here when it comes to affordable housing and making sure there's more of it. Some final thoughts for lawmakers as they consider at the state level what to do with affordable housing this session and into the future.
You know, I want them to consider environmental impact. Transportation and land use are around 70% of the state's fossil fuel emissions. And if we don't build housing in the areas we've already developed, the status quo is to pave farmland and tear down forests for low density subdivisions that not only destroy the natural environment, but require the highest fossil fuel use per capita of any built environment. I also want them to consider infrastructure maintenance. You know, WashDOT runs a $700 million annual deficit. We've estimated it would take more than our general fund every year just to bring our roads up to the current level of maintenance. And when we continue to build on the periphery, we just make more lane miles and more maintenance and more problems for our infrastructure. The infill growth that you can see in a city creates far less traffic and future infrastructure maintenance than the growth you can't see on the periphery. But mostly, I want them to consider people. Not just Tim's aunt, but people who stay put and pay 40, 50, 60% of their income for shelter, who are forced into long commutes just to be able to afford a basic need for their family. You know, if you get done at work at 5 and your kids go to bed at 8, a 90-minute commute steals half of the time you get to see your kids all week. People matter more than bureaucratic control and convenience.
Okay, I heard it right there. Well, Mayor Backus, some final words here. What do you want the legislature to be considering when it comes to this ban on single-family zoning, affordable housing, now and in the future?
Well, first and foremost, I am offering myself up as a member of local government to work together to find the right vehicle to ensure that this missing middle housing becomes available. I also believe that the money that was spent by the state legislature on creating or allowing cities to create these housing action plans should have the ability to be used to see how it works. That I don't want to see the government throwing away funding. We aren't in disagreement over the outcomes and the objectives. The outcome and the objectives is to have people of all levels of income in our community have affordable housing, whatever that income level is. And we're doing that in Auburn. We think that we are a model city for doing that, in fact, and are happy to work together. The goals are the same. It's the vehicle to get there that isn't.
Okay, thank you both very much for this, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about the proposal to abolish single-family zoning in order to create more affordable housing in Washington? One person writes, "It's great that this legislation, House Bill 1782, has failed to meet the deadline. It was a very faulty bill." Another group says, "Washington simply cannot meaningfully reduce its climate impact without increasing density near transit." We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattle.gov or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next time, help for homeowners as we enter year 3 of the COVID pandemic. The state is launching a pilot program to prevent foreclosures, missed mortgage payments, and loss of utilities for homeowners facing financial hardship. We bring you the details on the next City Inside Out. I hope you join us.